So good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome. My name is Ulrike Roesler, and I would like to welcome everyone on behalf of Tibetan and Himalayan Studies here at Oxford. And I won't take up very much time. I just want to say briefly what you can expect this afternoon. In March this year, an opulent, beautiful two-volume publication has come out on Tibetan manuscripts and early printed books, published by Cornell University Press and edited by Matthew Kapstein. And it's an enormous pleasure to have Professor Kapstein here with us today so that he can introduce these two volumes himself and give us a little overview what to find in the book. So we will start with that. We will then have a small roundtable discussion with several participants whom I will introduce properly later. And at the end, there will also be an opportunity for those in the room to have a Q&A session with all the panelists. But before we start, I have Charles Manson standing next to me. He is the Tibetan subject librarian in the Bodleian Library here in Oxford. And I know that he would like to say a few words.
Thanks very much. I've been working part-time at Bodleian Libraries for the past 15 years as a cataloguer of Tibetan works and for the Tibetan collections, and have been fortunate to observe from time to time some of the processes in creating this two-volume work. Firstly, at a couple of conferences in the USA and France, and on a few occasions when Professor Kapstein visited with his trusty camera, either at Bodleian Library or the British Library, when he was photographing manuscripts in their two collections, and also in several of Professor Kapstein's seminars on Tibetan manuscripts at EPHE. As you may know, or hopefully soon will see, many of the photographs in these two volumes are from the British Library collection. And in this regard, I feel today it would be appropriate just now to recall the helpfulness of the curator Burkhard Kessel, who retired last month after 27 years as curator of the Tibetan collections at the British Library. Several of the works featured in the two volumes are from Bodleian's collection, such as in Volume 1, the item known commonly as a passport, a sort of safe passage document from 1688, and also the manuscript that Evans Wentz referred to with Lama Kazidawa Sondrup in producing their well-known Tibetan Book of the Dead in 1927, now approaching a centenary. The Bodleian hopes within the next 3 years to commemorate the influence of this work. In Volume 2, there is relating to the Bodleian collections, there is the first volume of the 18th century Rigzen Sewang Nobu Nyingma Gyubum collection, just the first volume. The British Library has the other volumes, as well as an illuminated medical text, possibly 13th century, and an 18th century almanac. If I can just briefly return to the so-called merchant's passport, the safe passage document in Volume 1 for a short anecdote. It is known from a facsimile published in 1700 by Thomas Hyde. Hyde himself was a chief librarian at Bodleian, and in the 17th century, he was also advisor on Eastern affairs to three kings in England. The reproduction of the document through engraving is probably the first example of a complete document in Tibetan published in Europe. However, where is the document? For some time it has been thought to be missing, but just fairly recently, in 2023, Alessandro Bianchi and Dr. Katja Triplett found it amongst some miscellaneous documents of various scripts. What had happened is that these Hyde, being something of a magpie scholar in collecting Eastern documents, it had been put in a folder with some Japanese and other examples of script, and had been labelled as polyglot with the name Polyglot C1 for the size and number 1. Some years later, when this item, this folder, got boxed properly to be stored in the modern way, somebody, if you imagine a P written, especially in the 18th century, it looked somewhat like an H. It was a long downstroke and then a quite open P. So somebody had named the box Holyglot or Holyglot. And so it went missing for several years. It was just fortunate that they were looking for Japanese material and then they found this Tibetan and then, then we had a look at it. So in any case, now Bodleian itself has a copy of both volumes in the Charles David Reading Room in the Western Library in the reference section. And these were most kindly donated by Professor Kapstein.
So we are delighted to have Professor Matthew Kapstein here today. As you have heard, he is Emeritus Professor of the École Pratique in Paris, but currently he is the Numata Visiting Professor at the University of Chicago as well. And you all know him very well through numerous publications. I think all the Oxford students know him very well through the book The Tibetans, because there is no tutorial in which this book is not used. His many and varied research interests include Tibetan Buddhism, its literature and its intellectual history, as well as relations and interactions between Tibet, India, and China. So now, Matthew, the floor is yours, and please make Professor Kapstein further.
Thank you all for coming here today. It's a pleasure to see so many old friends. It's more like an old home reunion than an academic event in some ways. I have many thanks to make, but I'll try to keep it a little bit short so that I won't use all my time for that. First of all, to Ulrike Roesler, who had the lovely idea of organizing this event and bringing me here for it, for which I'm very grateful. Grateful too to all of those who have assisted her with this. In terms of the work on the book itself, I have to, of course, extend my great thanks to all my collaborators on this project. This was a work that involved, I think, 15 or 16 of us, as well as Cecil B. DeMille would have said, a cast of thousands. The names of the collaborators will appear shortly, but I'm very glad to see that present here today are Rob Mayer, Kathy Cantwell, Sam Van Schaik, who all contributed chapters to this work. The others who contributed through their learning, their help with collections, their assistance in innumerable ways are too many to mention, but of course, Charles Manson, who recorded our collective meetings and who was an invaluable aid with the collections here at the Bodleian, deserves my thanks, as does Hildegard Diemberger, who very generously introduced her work on books and manuscripts at Cambridge, and made and assisted me with access to material there. I think she will recognize as an acknowledgement of that the cover of the first volume is from the Cambridge collection. Very briefly, of course, I have to thank the production team at the Cornell University Press that I think very successfully realized these books, and the Henry Luce IV Foundation that provided the necessary financial assistance for this project. Beyond that, for the entire cast of thousands. I invite you to read the acknowledgments in the beginning of the work, which I hope mention all of those who are due thanks in connection with this project. Just to briefly introduce the work itself as well as the collaborators. The work is published in 2 volumes, the first of which, Elements, deals with subject matter that is broadly pertinent to the study of Tibetan manuscripts and books, whatever particular subject area you may be interested in. And so here we deal with issues like the material book itself, format, paleography, and so forth. I should say something just to digress a moment about why study Tibetan books, not for their content, but for the thing, for their thingness. And this was something that came home to me when I learned Tibetan. I did so in the early 1970s in Nepal. And the material conditions for accessing books were sometimes very, very difficult. And as I became more familiar with the channels that were involved, the routines of copying, the routines that were necessary to arrange for printing blocks where blocks were to be had, and so forth and so on, it increasingly became evident to me that the book is not only the bearer of its content, which is what we focus on in Tibetan studies, right? We're concerned with the great thoughts and the great writings of the masters, but the book is not only the bearer of its content, it is the nexus of an entire social and economic order. And as one enters into the book from that point of view and deals with artisans and paper makers and common people who scrape soot from their walls to make ink, and so forth and so on, the book introduces one to the entire fabric of the society. And so it's with that vision of things in mind that I was moved to focus in this area in part of my research. And at a certain point, I realized that there were a sufficient number of like-minded scholars so that it might be worth it to try to put our collective knowledge together, particularly at a time when the study of the Tibetan book was shifting to the use of digital resources and the like, and students coming into the field had less of that experience of rummaging through old libraries and having to find old sets of printing blocks and to see if something could still be revealed from impressions of them and so forth. And so it seemed to me worthwhile to make some effort to bring collective knowledge of these matters together to make them more available to those working in the digital age. And so that's what really motivated this project. So here's the first volume that deals really with the generalities. And the second volume is more focused then on particular genres and types of books, with the exception of the last section of case studies, which just gives 2 examples of focus studies on particular works. But the main part of the second volume is dealing with 4 important classes of works: manuscript collections, which form a very prominent part of Tibetan manuscript culture, official documents of various kinds, works on technical subjects, all of which have their own interesting and curious conventions, and finally, an important and often overlooked issue, which is the importance of the Tibetan book outside of Tibet, in neighboring Asian civilizations. The examples here, which are quite notable in this respect, are the Tibetan book among the Chinese and among the Mongols. Okay, the work is dedicated to Alasenga Tutenima Rinpoche. I think Hildegard will say more later, but let me just in brief say that I consider Zenka Rinpoche to be the great unsung hero of the study of Tibetan literary culture. For those who are familiar with his work, will know that just the massive submerged resources of Tibetan writing that began to become available following the end of the Cultural Revolution owe a huge, huge, huge debt to his continual efforts to ensure preservation and diffusion and access to this material. Okay, now what I wanted to do is then read some little selections from the introduction to the work, and I'll see how far I can get according to the time that's available. Okay. Open the Oxford Companion to the book, a mammoth work of over 1,400 pages, quote, covering the book broadly conceived throughout the world from ancient to modern times. And you will find that the word Tibet yields just a single occurrence, and Tibetan only 7 among the 48 essays and roughly 5,000 index entries contained therein. No entry is dedicated specifically to Tibetan books at all. No hint is to be found there that the history of the Tibetan book began a century before the age of Charlemagne and subsequently embraced cultural worlds extending from the Caspian Sea to Manchuria, from Siberia to Assam. Tibetan books continue to be published in large numbers today in South Asia and in Tibet itself, now divided among 5 provincial units in China. More pertinent to our present concerns, however, is the conservation in libraries and collections in many parts of Asia, Europe, and North America of hundreds of thousands of Tibetan manuscripts and early printed books, the fruit of the labors throughout the centuries of scribes and artisans in Tibet and its neighbors, and now the object of study for a dedicated community of readers and scholars, even if others know little about them. Whatever the reasons for the neglect of Tibet in the Oxford Companion to the book, the study of Tibetan book culture has advanced rapidly during the past quarter century and has emerged as a dynamic specialization within Asian studies and the history of the book more generally. Here, my collaborators and I hope to introduce and at the same time advance somewhat this area of research, both for those broadly interested in the traditional book cultures of Asia and for students entering Tibetan studies in particular, who increasingly depend on modern print and digital resources and so often lack exposure to the challenges and rewards of working directly with original manuscripts and xylographic prints. Tibetan manuscript Okay, I wanted to then skip ahead, I'm sorry. Okay, although the study of Tibetan manuscripts and early prints has emerged as a distinct area only recently, Western awareness of Tibet had its beginnings in the 13th century, when European visitors to the Mongol Empire encountered inter-Asian Buddhists and others who conveyed to them rumors and legends about that land. But the first Europeans to visit Tibet and to gain firsthand knowledge of its language and culture were Jesuit missionaries of the 17th century, whose early reports, in all events, appear not to have contained detailed accounts of either spoken or written Tibetan. The first known European publication of a specimen of Tibetan writing appeared not long after these pioneering missionaries' journeys in the work of the Dutch traveler, Orientalist, and statesman Nicolaas Witsen, who presented a brief description of the Tibetan characters in his Noord- and Oost-Tartary, There, a half-page plate depicting the Tibetan alphabet, which Witzen called Tangut, following the Mongol sources he encountered during his travels in Russia, was given in the first 1692 edition of his book and subsequently expanded in the second 1705 printing to include a 4-page syllabary. And it will be noticed that Witzen's Tibetan alphabet here is very defective. It's 27 characters instead of 30. They are disordered and sometimes misinterpreted. That's another story. I won't go into that in detail. But this is the first representation that I know of in the West. Witzen's initial publication of the alphabet was soon followed by the appearance of a complete Tibetan document. This was a merchant's passport. This is the document that Charles was talking about. Issued in Lhasa and dated 1688, that was reproduced in a careful engraving in the Orientalist Thomas Hyde's History of the Religions of Ancient Persia, Parthia, and Media. Hyde identified it as a sample of Tatar writing from Bhutan, Scriptorum Tatorum de Bhutan, though the final word should not be understood in its present sense, for in that period Bhutan was regularly employed just to mean Tibet, and not the country as we now understand it today. Oddly, Hyde, whose knowledge of Hebrew, Arabic, and Persian might have sensitized him to the ductus of the script, misjudged the orientation of the writing and thought it was to be read from right to left, like the Semitic scripts with which he was familiar. And though Hyde was undoubtedly aware of Witzen's work, for the two men were correspondents, he failed to recognize his Tatar writing from Bhutan to be a cursive form of the same Tangut script that Witzen had published just a few years before. Though Hyde had no idea of the literal content of his text, he nonetheless stated correctly that it was a passport issued to an Armenian merchant. This suggests that the individual from whom he acquired it, who is named as D. Joe Evans, was familiar with the document's background. Although it has not yet been possible to trace the passport's arrival in England with certainty, though I'm very glad to have learned from Charles's introduction today that the document itself has been traced, which I did not know when I wrote this. We may now surmise that the person named by Hyde was the Reverend John Evans, who served as chaplain to the East India Company in Bengal beginning in 1678, where he invested in ventures involving commerce with China and Persia. It was perhaps through such enterprise that he encountered the Armenian merchant to whom the Tibetan passport had been issued, or a knowledgeable intermediary. Evans returned to Oxford to complete his doctorate in 1695, at which time Hyde was professor of Arabic there. Given Hyde's, quote, intense intellectual curiosity about all things Asian, as the Dictionary of National Biography puts it, he would certainly have been fascinated by Evans' reports, and in particular by his unusual sample of Tatar writing. The excellence of the reproduction he published, a near-perfect model of a central Tibetan official hand, may be explained by the use of the camera obscura, which had become current during the 17th century and had revolutionized the art of the period thanks to its deft employment by painters such as Johannes Vermeer. But the exactitude of the image aside, no correct reading of the document appeared until 1833, when one of the founding figures of modern Tibetology, Alexander Kshomadakouros, published a short article about it. Within a few years of Witzen's and Hyde's publications, however, Catholic missionaries in Tibet and the Himalayas were beginning to master the Tibetan language, while at the same time the expansion of the Russian Empire in the East led to explorations of Mongol Buddhist lands where Tibetan was the scriptural language. New information on Tibetan became available to European Orientalists from both sources, which contributed to the formation of a growing body of early Tibetological scholarship, or one could say proto-Tibetological scholarship, often mixing fact and fantasy, that began to appear periodically in learned publications throughout the 18th century. The first Europeans to achieve some real knowledge of Tibetan seem to have been the Capuchin missionaries Giuseppe d'Ascoli and François-Marie de Tours, who arrived together in Lhasa in 1707. Their notes on the language were transmitted to their confrère Domenico da Fano, who composed on this basis in Italian and Latin the first European grammar and glossary of Tibetan. His work on the Tibetan language, which was never published, survives in manuscripts in several European collections, attesting to its diffusion in learned milieu, and it came to play an important role together with Witsen's syllabaries in the efforts of 18th century Orientalists to penetrate the Tibetan language. Their growing interest was fueled by the appearance of new reproductions of Tibetan documents stemming from manuscript discoveries being made in the course of the eastward expansion of the Russian Empire. You can immediately see from the little example I show in detail here how difficult it would have been to have used De Fano's grammar and dictionary for any practical purpose. I just give here the two entries of the word gun, very common Tibetan postpositional modifier meaning all, the adjective all. And there are two definitions given here. One is nihil, which is only explicable if we think of its use in negatives, such as kuneme, no way, no how. That would explain the nihil. And the second is statua, meaning a statue, and this is only explicable if we think of it as being a misrepresentation of the first syllable of kundra, an image or statue. And so you can imagine what anyone actually trying to use this to decipher Tibetan documents would have come up with. At any rate, returning to the... tell me, Ulrike, if I'm okay for time.
Try to wrap up in 10 minutes from now.
10 minutes, okay, good. Any rate, to return to the finds from Russia, I'll just now summarize and go through that. The first that was published was a folio found in what's today Kazakhstan, from a ruined temple of the Dzungar Mongols, who in the 17th century migrated from Mongol regions westward until they reached the region of Astrakhan, where they became known as Kalmuk. This is a folio that was incorporated in the Tsar's library and then brought to Paris, and then found its way to publication in a learned journal in Leipzig, the Acta Eruditorum. And you can see the reproduction is excellent, but clearly the editor had no idea how it was to be oriented, so you have one side of the folio that's upside down and the other that is correctly oriented. And the editor of the journal that published it had no idea what language this was. It was a complete mystery to him. But it was almost immediately recognized by a pair of Orientalists in France, the Formant brothers, as Tibetan, because they had access to Da Fano's dictionary and grammar. And so they, on that basis, attempted to translate this. And what they came up with was just wonderful fantasy. They describe it as, but it's important because it's the first Western attempt to translate a Tibetan document, right? The very first, in which they concluded that this was a sermon composed to honor a minor saint, in which the author proposed to prove the immortality of the soul by comparison of the different circumstances distinguishing the ends of man from those of the animals. Actually, it's a folio of a tantric text from the Kanjur that gives the mantras of the main bodhisattvas. And once again, it was Alexander Chomedekouros who, in the 1830s, published finally a correct interpretation of this work. Shortly after this was published, another of the Siberian finds found its way into a very important work, Philipp Johann von Strahlenberg's historical geographical description of the north and eastern parts of Europe and Asia, which was one of the groundbreaking works on the geography of the whole Russian East. Very, very important work of scholarship. Again, they still had no idea that this script and the Uten script were related. And so Strahlenberg was completely mystified by this and published it really as a curiosity. Though he has some very interesting notes about other folios from these finds that came to his attention and raises some questions about the use of block printing, and his observations are actually quite fascinating, though he had no idea what this was. Actually, it is a right to the protective divinities that one finds the text also in the works of the fifth Dalai Lama, whether it's drawn directly from that source or a common source of the two is not clear, but that is not so important. At any rate, returning briefly to the missionaries in Tibet, there's been a tendency in current scholarship to think that the great figure was the Jesuit Ippolito Desideri, whose knowledge of Tibetan was absolutely remarkable. He wrote in Tibetan. He had a compendious knowledge of Tibetan scholasticism, but he had absolutely no impact on knowledge of things Tibetan because controversy in Rome led his works to be suppressed until the end of the 19th century. So no one knew what Desideri had done. His successors of the Capuchin order, who have been much derided in scholarship, actually made their own very important contributions. Again, much of that was lost owing to a fire that destroyed the Capuchin headquarters in Rome in the late 19th century. However, we do have evidence of their work from one of the strangest books on Tibet ever published, Augustini Antoni Giorgi's Alphabetum Tibetanum. The Alphabetum Tibetanum is a sprawling work in about 900 pages that was very much written under the star of Athanasius Kircher and the project to create a system of universal knowledge based on biblical tradition. And so Giorgi took what he had received from the Capuchins and mixed it up with fantastic speculations about Syriac and Chaldean and any number of biblical traditions of many kinds. However, where he was following the Capuchins closely, he demonstrates that their knowledge was actually quite remarkable. One innovation we find here is the first use of Tibetan movable type. These pages reproduce selections from the contracts that the Capuchin missionaries drew up with their hosts in Tibet, with the Tibetan government, for the rental of properties and the like. They are accurately translated and interpreted in Latin, and mostly accurately reproduced in the somewhat inelegant but still quite readable script that one finds here. But from the point of view of the study of the book, that is our concern here, the really great thing that Georgi reflects about Capuchin learning is a knowledge of Tibetan codicology that was unequaled for the next 2 centuries almost. He provides descriptions of pens, ink, blocks, cover boards. In discussing paper, he is clear about the distinction between paper from Dakpo, which was considered fine, refined paper for use in official circumstances, and a coarser paper from Zhang. He did not yet know that this was materially based in part on the distinction between Daphne Edgeworthia base papers and Stellara base papers that we find elsewhere. But the distinction of Tibetan paper types is already discussed in 1762. Nothing else approaches this until fairly recently. And then there's also information. For the first time, again in this work, we have the distinction between the Tibetan Uchen block print script and Ume cursive and calligraphic scripts accurately understood. And indeed, it's in Georgi for the first time that Hyde's document is, even if not interpreted, correctly understood to be in a form of Tibetan writing. Returning again to the finds from Siberia, he uses them as examples to demonstrate the way Tibetan pagination works and so forth. In other words, there are quite a lot of accurately described dimensions of Tibetan book culture that we find in this otherwise completely bizarre and fantastic work on Tibet. The result of Georgi's promotion of a Tibetan type font is that standard works on printing in Europe begin to incorporate Tibetan as one of the scripts that should be part of a printery, a well-founded printery. An influential example is Abbé Jean-Raymond de Petity's Bibliothèque des Artistes in the volume on printing. And soon we have Tibetan printing being done in Paris, Berlin, Kazan, St. Petersburg, Calcutta, and elsewhere. One effect of this, of course, though, is to remove attention from the study of Tibetan paleography, right? Because people are looking at printed books. And it's only again in the work of Alexander Kshuma-Dakuris where we have a beautiful supplement of lithograph plates of Tibetan scripts that we have something like the basis for the study of Tibetan paleography coming into the fore. Just quickly, some examples of printery work, the Lalita Vistara Sutra Gacharova on the left, published in Paris, and on the right, selections from Vasilyev's great work on Buddhism, published in St. Petersburg with the beautiful type font there, giving the Tibetan in parentheses. But still, attention by now is mostly on content, only to a lesser extent on the book itself. We have to wait until 1912 for Baco's work on l'écriture cursive Tibetan for another advance in paleographical study, where he includes a very interesting and still worthwhile index of Tibetan Gungik contractions, abbreviations, with some 700 items. And then, again, nothing until in 1949, the doctoral thesis of Nebesky-Wojtkiewicz, which is never published, and in which Nebesky-Wojtkiewicz attempts to provide a synthesis of knowledge of Tibetan scripts, paper making, and printing, together with a rather interesting glossary that he compiled of terms relating to the Tibetan book world. But again, this was a dead letter owing to the lack of its publication and the only recent retrieval of it for the curiosity of those who were involved in this area of study. It's only then really beginning in the 1970s, 80s, 90s that we see the study of the Tibetan book really re-emerging as a central feature of Tibetan studies. And I will conclude there.
Thank you so much for this overview, and it just shows us how lucky we are, doesn't it? I mean, with easy access nowadays to resources, but also the ability to talk to people, which all these people didn't have.
Yeah.
So, in any case, can I now invite the panelists for the roundtable discussion to the podium, and we'll move this chair. And just briefly, I've already introduced Professor Kapstein, but let me also introduce the other panelists. Dr. Hildegard Diemberger, she is the research director at the Mongolia and Inner Asia Studies Unit at the University of Cambridge. She is a social anthropologist and Tibetologist with publications on a wide range of topics, including sacred landscapes, female Buddhist masters, but also Tibetan books and Tibetan printing. And therefore, we are very happy to have her here so that she can comment on from this angle. Dr. Lama Jabb is lecturer in Tibetan language here at the University of Oxford, very well known for his book on oral and literary continuities in modern Tibetan literature and his publications on modern Tibetan poetry and fiction. His research interests include the interplay between oral and written literature, issues of translation, and national and cultural identity as reflected in Tibetan fictional writing and poetry. And Dr. Sen van Schaik is head of the Endangered Archives program at the British Library. He's well known through his research on Buddhism in Tibet and along the Silk Roads. Before joining the Endangered Archives program, he was project manager for the international Dunhuang project, overseeing the digitization of the Dunhuang manuscripts in the British Library. This has given him extensive experience with old Tibetan manuscripts and has resulted in various publications on this topic and a fantastic blog. And I'm still hoping that you will pick up that blogging again. In any case, so many thanks to all the panelists for being here, and the floor is now yours, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ulrike. That was tremendous. And thank you for organizing this event, because I think it's a rare opportunity to be able to enjoy the launch of this amazing book. And congratulations, Matthew, because it is amazing. And it's an amazing book about books. And this is also reflected in the cover. We see also ancient scholars there holding books. In many ways, it is really a book about books. And I would like to draw attention to the fact that the thingness, the materiality of books, in many ways, often is taken for granted. But actually, as Matthew was saying, in many ways, it deserves its own kind of attention. And this has happened now increasingly so. I would like, however, to start with, in some ways, a comment and a praise for Zenka Rinpoche, to whom the entire volume is dedicated, because he has been an amazing inspirational figure for many of us. And in many ways, we should imagine the ways in which he intervened in the rescuing and reproducing of books in a situation that was absolutely disastrous. And I know that many of you have traveled across the Himalayas and Tibet. And I know that many of you probably have encountered, the books abandoned in caves or in some kind of dusty back of altars, rotting. So really, there was an amazing treasure that has been kind of across the Tibetan plateau that was hidden from the times in which many of these precious books were being destroyed. But in many ways, it was also difficult to rescue them. And Dzongkha Rinpoche has been so inspirational in inspiring and training a wide range of scholars across Tibetan communities so that they became what Burkhard Quessel defined the flying cataloging commando, in the sense that, and that was the name that he gave to one of these networks, but there were many more. And they really went from one monastery or private archive to the next, often also training up the local monks or people and assisting really in pulling together, putting these, often mountains of loose sheets in order, and publishing, when possible, catalogs. The Drepung catalog is, I think, a very famous kind of feat in this direction. But so he's been fantastic, and I would say, however, that I would not like to mention Dzongkha Rinpoche alone, because together with him is the late Gene Smith, who was also a tremendous inspiration, starting from when he was working at the Library of Congress and assisting many Tibetans who were coming out of Tibet with books, with not only the preservation, but also reprinting of books and identifying and putting in order what was right now, at that point, really a mega operation of rescuing what was a fantastic heritage, but which was extremely under threat. So Dzongkha Rinpoche and G. Smith have been fantastic as inspirational figures, and in many ways their attention was not only on the content of the books. They have been very much engaged also with the materiality of them, whether it is by appreciating the paper, but also just simply the handling of some of these books. I know sometimes these books were all kind of mashed up and glued together, and Dzongkha Rinpoche had interesting ways in trying to kind of rescue the sticking together pages of volumes, and often not having at disposal the professional restorers of the British Library, or having to work with the means they had. And this leads me to some extent also to the other bit of front matter that we have in the volume, which is the acknowledgements. And I think that looking at this book about books, what I find fantastic in the list of names and networks of scholars that one can find in the acknowledgement, looking at, in some ways, deciphering that, one realized that this book is in many ways also the reflection of wider networks of scholars. And in many ways, we see also how books make communities. So the books are not just the object. The books are the reflection of networks, of people engaged in the production, reproduction, reading, reinterpretation of these literary artifacts. And from that point of view, perhaps as an anthropologist, I realized personally how much books are at the center of networks. They create communities, but also have an amazing power to do things. Sometimes we treat them as passive objects, but actually they do have an amazing kind of power to let people do things. And from that point of view, I really remember the moment in which Dzongkha Rinpoche and Gene Smith were with me in a coffee shop in New York. I had gone to New York for a conference, and Gene Smith told me, "Oh, you went to Cambridge now. Do you know that there is the young husband collection there and nobody's doing anything about it?" And I had just moved to Cambridge. I know almost nothing about it all. And I realized that basically these books in the library, but not properly engaged with, were very much exercising an immense moral pressure on me, in the sense that I came back, I had to produce an application and get some funding to get them recatalogued, and here Burkhard Quessel, among others, were extremely instrumental. But I realized in many ways that I was caught up in the morality of the book in many ways, as many of the practitioners of Tibetan Buddhism are. You know, it wouldn't be possible to put a book on the floor. And if you have books in this array, that is seen really as a kind of, as a moral fault. And I think, so it is fantastic that engaging with books as things and how they are produced, the importance of their paper, their pigments, what stories they can tell us looking at how their formats, how they were edited, how they were preserved. This is something that opens up so many amazing stories, and so many stories that brought together a lot of different people from different backgrounds, because this is what is fantastic, is perhaps also thanks to the now digital technologies, it has become also more easy. It's become easier to kind of transmit, access text, but also to connect communities of scholars across the globe. And from that point of view, the engagement with books has also reflected, I think, a transformation from a situation in which we had bodies of Tibetological scholarship very much Europe-based or US-based or Euro-American-based, but kind of separated from what was happening, say, in Tibet, with all its ups and downs, and in various Himalayan valleys, and in Mongolia, and across various Asian countries, to a situation in which actually you have a lot of collaboration around these amazing collections, amazing artifacts. And I think that this book is a treasure of stories, of possibilities, of works that are going to inspire many generations to come. So thank you very much, Matthew.
Thanks, Hildegard. That's really inspiring. And I just then I think maybe briefly want to say a little bit about how I came to find manuscripts really important at the center of kind of understanding the world, really. Because I started with my studies working on texts. I worked on the text of Jigme Lingpa for my thesis, and then thanks to Burkhard Quessel, who we all seem to be mentioning tonight, I got a job at the British Library. So, you know, astonishingly, having done a PhD out of a kind of passion for these texts, I got a job. But the job was a bit different. I had to work on a catalogue of Tibetan wooden slips from the Central Asian forts of the Tibetan Empire. And it was very hard to put these together with the Dzogchen texts that I've been studying, but it was fascinating. They were pieces of wood that were written on with little orders for soldiers and little notes between them that were discovered by the explorer Mark Orlstein in the early 20th century and were sent to the British Library. So that was a job, but what followed that was then a more kind of connected piece of work on the Tibetan tantric manuscripts from the same collections. So briefly, the Stein collections are part of a kind of colonial, explorative thing that went on in the early 20th century. Incredible material for Central Asian and Tibetan history across that region of the Silk Road that was taken away to the collections of Europe, Japan, and Russia that we worked on. And the key kind of collection here is the Cave 17 at Dunhuang Mogao, which was sealed in the early 20th century and reopened sealed in the early 11th century and reopened in the early 20th century with a kind of time capsule of 900 or so years in between. And it was found to contain the earliest surviving Tibetan manuscripts at that point. Some more have been found in central Tibet since then. And there's a history of their study that's equally interesting and is part of the story that Matthew was telling of Tibetology and the study of Tibetan scripts. But but for me, it was just great to be able to link these early kind of tantric texts to what I saw later on in Tibet. But very quickly, something else emerged, which was that I couldn't just think about these things in terms of texts. These were physical objects written in weird arrays of writing styles by clearly a group of people, a fairly small group of people who wrote on the back of each other's manuscripts or corrected each other, or sometimes it seemed would be sitting and listening to the same teaching, or taking the same empowerment and then writing down their own versions of it. So in this work, which I did with Jake Dalton, who's now at University of Berkeley, we both came to feel that we were in the presence of like ghosts, almost, or more than ghosts, very real feeling people who had created these manuscripts that we were working on now at the British Library, and so we came to sort of move outside of that cataloging world and think about how do we kind of make sense of who these people were and what they were doing and what were their relationships to each other. So that was the sort of move in two directions. One is paleography, which Matthew was talking about a bit in terms of looking at different kinds of Tibetan script. So one thing that we did was dating manuscripts through the handwriting, because one of the things that you see in Dunhuang is the handwriting changes, and from the earliest manuscripts in the early 9th century to the latest ones in the late 10th century, there's a great development in the beauty of the script, basically. A kind of calligraphic handwriting emerges, which is really noticeable and helps you to date the manuscripts. But the other thing is looking at the kind of forensic analysis of, can you identify somebody's personal handwriting? And we brought in a guy, Tom Davis, who was actually an English lecturer at the University of Birmingham, but also worked in the law courts, where he did handwriting. He was an expert witness on identifying handwriting. So basically, if somebody had written a ransom note and they were being accused, then you could look at their other shopping list and say, yes, this was the same person. And we worked with him, and we applied the same principle he did, which is to go down to the individual letters, get as many examples as you can, and compare them to each other, and basically look for the kind of unconscious features of those letters that people use. So we did that work, and we did identify individuals, and we did kind of get a sense of who these ghostly figures were that created the manuscripts. And it was fascinating. And one of the things that revealed for the practice of Tibetan Buddhism 1,000 years ago was, for example, if you look at one of the early Dzogchen texts from Dunhuang, in the same handwriting you do have a Torma text. So there's no sense that the Dzogchen text saying you don't need to do any practice meant that people actually didn't make Torma, for example. So that's one of the ways that we found sort of going into the manuscriptness, the kind of physical features of the manuscripts really opened out this study, this cataloging, and brought to life that community. And it just gave me a kind of, since then, a lifelong sense that every manuscript, the kind of thingness that Hildegard and Matthew have mentioned, that they are for these hundreds or 1,000 years ago, they're what's left to us, but they were part of a kind of part of a relationship between people and things. And we have the things, and through the things we can understand the people much more than we can just through texts alone. And I think that's something that comes out in the book that we're talking about, the 2 volumes tonight, that these are very alive things, and the more you look into them, the more interesting and alive they get, and more the people around them kind of come to life. So that's it, I think. I'll hand over to Lama Jabb.
Thank you very much. That's 2 fascinating talks, short speeches. Thank you very much. So this two-volume publication is truly awesome. I actually, judging by the kind of few contributions that I managed to dip into, all the pieces promise to be illuminating, I think. I should pay homage to it. And really, with deep gratitude and admiration, I would like to congratulate Matthew and all the contributors on actually kind of ensuring that the Tibetan book is present in the field of the kind of ever-flourishing, changing global book studies. So thank you very much. And I thought I'd actually say a few things about the book, just what the Tibetans call the book. But before I say that, let me respond to what Hildegard said, just to continue from what you said. And I myself, actually, was born in Tibet at the later stages of the Cultural Revolution. So I was born at a time that books were banned, traditional books were banned and mostly destroyed or hidden. So in my family, all the nomadic families have books, by the way. And by at least you need to have 3 books. Galozong Tongsem, it says, Gazang, Zongju, and Jatompa. Those 3 are must books in a family, on a family altar. So when I was born, all those books were either destroyed or confiscated or buried underground. So I was born at a time like that. So I would like to also say, not only Zanka Rinpoche, of course Zanka Rinpoche's contribution was unbelievable, but of course His Holiness, the Dalai Lama and the great Tibetan masters who came into exile contributed massively. But more than that, I would say, actually, it's ordinary Tibetans, ordinary Tibetan farmers and nomads who actually risked their lives inside Tibet as well as escaping Tibet, carrying texts, bearing texts, and keeping them alive till after the Cultural Revolution. So we should not forget these people, I think. And so let me say a very brief thing about the Tibetan word. I just will be quick because I'm sure you're dying to ask a few questions. In terms of my own study field is literature. So in terms of kind of literary and poeticity, poetic dimensions of the Tibetan text, Tibetan books, poetry is really unavoidable. What the Vortis dictum said, that image is the primary pigment of poetry. So if you look at even in the samples in here, those images are both actually the visual representations as well as poetic images in the texts are unavoidable. But I would like to say that, Tibetans actually, there's this kind of poeticity in the name for the Tibetan book. So the poetic kind of in a profoundly, kind of philosophically profound way. So we call it pecha, you know that. Pecha. So it could be referred to into English as the metaphor dimension or the metaphor factor, or to echo the first subtitle of the first volume, the metaphor element. So this name intimates that it is the entity that reflects or contains the image of reality or all the phenomena that envelopes us. So the pecha is obviously closely associated with the famous Tibetan or frequently used Tibetan idiom, chutamchil perecharwa. So all the phenomena appears as metaphor. This is image or representation of the ultimate reality. So pecha is sometimes a fragment, represents a fragment of the reality itself, or represents image of an image of an image. So pecha has got all those elements, and so I think it's interesting to think of that. And obviously also the reason that Tibetans really kind of appreciate and worship, as Hildegard mentioned, is one of these reasons. I mean, this is one of the reasons, because it reflects actually ultimate reality. But pecha also reflects not the ultimate reality as in emptiness born of dependent origination, the profound stuff, but also, as your preface to the book volume acknowledges, it reflects the profane realm of relative reality, of history, of language, of taxation, of paying bills, passport, all that. So I think it's incredible, it's amazing. And all this, for all these reasons, Tibetans refer to, I'm sure all of you are aware of this, the kind of when Tibetans speak about books, they use honorific language or personifications. So they talk about Sonsum Danshu, inviting a book, Pecha Lanje, you know, paying homage, or actually, like as if you're seeing His Holiness the Dalai Lama or somebody, Pecha Shashi, Pecha Gungarawala Ju, so you kind of take it up there, and Pecha La Nabza Pu, Pecha Lu, you never say Pecha Nyo. You don't buy a book, you actually, you know, gladly donate for something, exchange for it. All this kind of reveals that the reason, because it reflects, I think, reality. This is one of the reasons. But I think you're all dying to ask a few questions. So as time is of the essence, I'll also kind of end with a few questions to Matthew. And it is indeed really mind-blowing to think the kind of diversity and wealth of Tibetan texts that feature in these two volumes. Yet, we all know there's all the range of texts in here in terms of literary genre, in terms of subject matter, in terms of materiality of the book, everything. Still lots of things are left out there. So there are still prominent genres I'm talking about, not just small, minor ones like Longtan, Tarcho Parama, or like various forms of wind horse kind of printing and prints, or Meloma, Nyangar Meloma, the caviar poetry, or George is here, guess epic kind of prints. So many different things are not included here. So my kind of first question is that how did you make the challenging kind of decisions of selection and omission in this kind of respects? That's my first question. Let me just finish for you. And my second question, please do not take this as an ungrateful, cynical remark. But I must kind of ask this out of wonder. Why aren't there any contributions by Tibetans or Mongols or Burmese or other indigenous Tibetan scholars? And my last question is the use of actual Tibetan script in the body of the text would further enhance the aesthetic appeal and heighten the showcasing of the Tibetan written word. When it is all about the Tibetan written word, there's Wiley in there. So I wonder why the decision was made to opt for Wiley for citation and for parentheses and things like that. So, sorry to end on that slightly critical sounding remarks, but thank you very much. Ultimately, I'm grateful.
Thank you all for your comments. I'll try to just answer Lama Jabb's very pertinent questions very briefly, because I think his points are all very well taken. And first of all, there was no omission. There was nothing omitted at all. The range, the book itself acknowledges that what we have here is only a part of a very large domain. And the reasons that it takes the form it did reflects in part the expertise and specializations of the persons involved, rather than any deliberate decision to exclude some things. So that's certainly not part of it. The most important question, the most delicate one I think you ask is why there are not Tibetan contributors, because this is something that was actually a source of considerable anguish in developing this project. There are, as you know in the acknowledgements, there are quite a lot of Tibetan scholars who are acknowledged. And there are several of them who I really wanted to have as participants. But unlike many collective projects where you have one meeting and everyone contributes an article, this was conceived as a rather long-term project that required repeated meetings and repeated discussion in order to achieve a certain kind of coherence. And during the period we did it, at least in my relations with the authorities that be, it was not possible to assure that the kind of long-term collaboration that was required could actually be realized. And that was an administrative problem that I found myself facing, and I realized I had to make some choices on that basis, and I was not really happy with that, but that's how that was. And I've tried as much as I could in the work where there are publications emerging by Tibetan scholars, whether in Tibetan or other languages that are pertinent here. I tried in all cases to make sure that that material was well referenced and hope that it will be very widely used. In terms of the question about Tibetan script, there are, of course, in the Tibetan glossary in the second volume does use Tibetan script. The reason for which I did not highlight Tibetan script throughout were two. One was certain practicalities dealing with the very excellent designers that I was dealing with had no experience with the Tibetan script, and even with the Tibetan we had, it was very, very problematic and took many cases. But also because, although I did want these books to play a role in Tibetan studies, if you go back to my initial reference to the Oxford companion to the book, I really wanted to provide something that would play a role in the way people concerned with the history of the book globally would think about Tibetan books. And to have a book full of Tibetan script, I knew for that universe would just put people off too much. It would be too intimidating. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I felt that that was the judgment I had to make there. So the Tibetan script is more light, it is used, but it is more lightly used than in the best of all possible worlds I would have wanted. But again, it was, one makes with any project a certain number of strategic calculations that with hindsight may be better or worse, but that's what was done. Thanks. But I'm grateful for those comments, and I don't take
get
them.
offended.
I'm not offended at all. I think they're all very well taken points, Lama, Jabb.